call the meeting order. It is 5 o'clock and I heard everybody's here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's get right into it. Our first topic is our FMP 2.0, kind of our next steps. Who wants to kick us off?
So Chase is going to pass around a document here. We're excited to talk to you guys tonight, kind of following our community engagement time that we had throughout the summer as we showed what those different stakeholder planning priorities were that matched up with your guiding principles, and then the portrait of graduate competencies. And then the next iteration of that is to try to talk about the actual projects, right? What is some level of specificity that we can provide around some projects, knowing that some conversations are still more long-term or it requires some additional engagement and conversation. So tonight, what the team wanted to really walk you through was our approach to maybe how to start to communicate some of this work leading up to that vote in November. So with that, I'll let Chase go from there and walk you through the different pieces we have for this evening.
Thanks, Matt, and good evening. I'm going to add a few words, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Dwayne. Diane, don't worry. I'm not keep going around.
Yeah.
But hopefully this document is very familiar by now. It's kind of the roadmap that we've used throughout the spring, and we use it at the Ops Committee with the board, and we just kind of keep layering on pieces. And through some great collaboration with our community, we finished off that front page by filling out those 6 planning priorities. And so then it's on to the projects. And as Matt mentioned, we're trying to strike this balance between specificity, but also giving us enough room as an organization to make sure that we can make changes and plan as they come. As we've talked about, this is all leading up to the PEPL and the SAVE vote in November, and it's not a bond, and so there are no new cost initiatives that are on the ballot. We think that's an important message, that this is different from the bonds. We love to talk that level of specificity, and it's really to keep in place levies that are already there, that we're already drawing from. And they are important to continue this work. And so as Matt mentioned, we've laid out into 3 buckets, and we've intentionally kept it general. We want to engage the board in some conversation after you hear some information from Dwayne about how specific you want any one of these categories to be before we get to November. And then we also want to just have some conversation with the board, specifically around that group 3 at the bottom, long-term considerations. There's a lot of different elements there, and we talked about these at our last meeting together, but those that participate in the different sessions, these are themes that we heard, but they're really items that we would need more direction from the board before we would want to go out and speak publicly about facility enhancements that we would make based on one of those. And so we feel like we need to have some of that conversation with the board. Again, because it's not a bond, we don't need to have that lined out. But we also know that we're asking for these revenue streams for many years to come, so we owe it to the public to give them a roadmap of where we think that we're going, at least in a general sense. So Dwayne, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how some of these projects came to be, from a general sense or even a specific sense, and why they ended up in these buckets where they did.
Okay. Well, we'll start with back in February, I think it was, Janet, Lisa, we had our operations meeting. We had a whole list. We talked about projects. And since that time, the list has changed a little bit. I sat down with Jeff Barnes and Michelle Webster, and we spent some time going through the projects. And a lot of things we had on our list have actually been accomplished. We had some things accomplished through our projects. We had some funds available, so we used them. We accomplished some of that. And we know that some of the life cycle projects can be done through our typical PEPL projects, like parking lots and things like that. So I was able to pare the list down a little bit, but then as a result of finishing up some of these projects, the scope that you want to do kind of grows. The scope always tends to grow a little bit. You know, as you go through, well, we should have done this, or we should have done that. You know, the fact of the matter is, when you do a project and you price it out, like City High is a good example. And, it was over budget. Remember that? So we went back and did value engineering, and we reduced the scope by like $6 million. But during the process, you go, well, we should have done that, or we should have done this, or we probably shouldn't have taken that off. And you find things like that as you go through those projects. So some of that is back in here. So, for example, at City High, you know, we didn't do the what I call the northeast wing. We had to pull that off. So that needs to be done. You know, we need to finish career tech. You know, that's a big desire, so we need to do that. even though we've started that project, or will be starting this fall through Pebble, they're gonna start building some frame walls just to establish the space, but we still need to finish the space, so things like that. And so I went through and we kind of went through the list and put them in general categories, but the first part called critical needs is probably a better word. It's critical needs, but it's also left off scope, the scope that we didn't do. You know, we need to do to finish the projects. I just talked about City High, there's certainly several others. You know, Shimmick's another example of one that we didn't do the multi-purpose room. We need to finish it. You know, they need to be on that same level with all the other schools. So those are the kind of projects that we put in this first group, things that we know the district should do to finish off these projects. Southeast Junior High, Northwest Junior High, they need kitchens. The Southeast Junior High kitchen is probably one of the worst in the district for a school that size. It's outdated, it's small, it's hard to get anything done, it's not very productive, even though they produce a lot of food. So that's one project, you know, right out the chute that we need to look at. Other projects like that. So those are the kinds of projects we put in the first bucket. The second bucket are, we said, you know, some of these are truly long-term life cycle. We know for a fact that we did the City High turf field at Bates Field, at the soccer field. That was done in 2012. Well, it's pushing almost 10 years old. Those fields only last 12, 13 years max. So we know we're going to have to replace it. We know it's $1 million bill. And we know that we got one, we did West High, I think it was in 2014, something like that. It was a year or two after I got here. We know that's coming. And Liberty High, you know, we did that in, what, 16, 17, was it, or 18? But that's going to be coming up too. So I put those kind of projects in here. And the other kind of projects are in this life cycle costs are like, we know all our buildings are air conditioned, but the fact is the systems at Weber and Wickham, things like that, they really need to be updated. And those are going to be aging out. So we put some money in for that. There's money in here for playgrounds we talked about many times. It needs to be, that's another life cycle project. Technology, security, climate action's a big one. We know we're going to need to make some improvements in the schools and upgrade the equipment in the kitchens and things like that. Get rid of our natural gas dependency, so, which we've done a good job, but we need to keep doing it. And then the third group, long term, you know, we need, I still feel like I'm still part of the team.
You are.
You're always going to be part of the team, Dwayne.
Huh?
You're always going to be part of the team.
Okay, thanks. But, you know, we need to buy some property. We need to go out there and look for property acquisitions in every part of town, southwest, southeast, and even north to a certain extent. So you need to be proactive and work with developers, and we have. We've worked with several developers here, and they've been very helpful, and they're already thinking about what can we carve out for the school in the future, because they all know their developments are going to depend on schools in the right place. So, you know, we did that with Hoover, we did that with Alexander, we did that with Grant. There's those developers in those areas know how important these schools are. But, so they're willing to work with us, but it's a big area where we need to really pinpoint where we want to be and buy the right properties. With property purchases, you're going to want to build new buildings. So you have to talk about buildings too. And we were discussing the other day, you know, there's some decisions that the board's going to have to make in the next few months. Hopefully soon after you get it approved, you know, we get moving here. Is, you know, are we going to do preschool rooms, or are we going to do preschool centers? We're going to do early childhood centers, or, you know, and what's your grade configuration? I know you guys had some discussions about that. And grade configuration affects how we do our buildings and where we put them. You know, so I'm not telling you tonight what I think you should do or give you advice, but you guys need to talk about it, because we're going to kind of hit roadblocks. Where are we going to go down this path or this one? You know, based on where you want to be with your grade configuration, your buildings, and where we buy our properties, that type of thing. So you've got a lot of major decisions to make with that. And with that is capacity expansions. You know, I hate to say it, but I think you're going to have to start thinking about adding on to City High. You know, and maybe even West High. And there's places on both buildings where you could do it. And I know it sounds crazy at City High, but there's a way to do it. And even at Liberty in the future, or do you do that? So your high schools are gonna start, they're gonna continue to grow if your lower levels grow. So you're gonna have to look at that. If you reconfigure your let's say you go to a middle school concept, by doing that, you automatically free up capacity in the elementary schools. So you have more classrooms, you have more rooms for programs, you have more rooms for students, whatever you want to do with that, because I know you want to do some special programs as well, so. And with that, magnet schools, that's another one. So I really think you have a lot of serious decisions that you need to make in the next few months, next year, to keep this thing on track. So even though we have projects we already know that need to be done, it would be my desire, my recommendation, get those going. Get them started. Let's start next year. Let's get them going. And then the long-term life cycle will work themselves out over the years. As they come along, you'll have some say on that. And then the third part is we really need to make those kind of long-term decisions to keep it going, so you buy properties in the right place and build the right kind of buildings. You certainly wouldn't want to build a new junior high and say, oh, we want to go to middle school. Might be different. Might have been a different place. Might be, a different way of doing it. So I think you need to have some real discussions. Climate action is long-term. I think we just need to be committed to it. We are. We've done a lot already. I think we're probably miles ahead of most school districts in the state of Iowa. I can say that without any reservation, because I know what we've accomplished. But you just need to keep it going. A lot more needs to be done. I think I've hit on most of those. Health clinics was another one. We're seeing more and more requests. I've seen Jessica there, so I'm thinking of her. But we just worked out a kind of a compromise on a health clinic at Northwest Junior High as part of the project. But and they have one in Southeast. But then we just put one in the city not too long ago. But they're I think wanting to have a more visible presence, maybe at Liberty High, West High, and other places. So we need to think about health clinics as well. And if, how committed is the district to that? Is that something you want to do or not do, or what we have fine? I don't know. Might be. I think if you ask Jessica, she'd want more. Others might say you have enough. Why are we doing that? Why are we in the health business? Well, it's good for our students, right? So that's another one. And then I guess the last one I'll touch on is athletic venues. I see this trend across the country, and I know you've had some discussions about sharing facilities. Build one facility that all high schools can share. That's another concept that you might look at doing in the future. In Moines schools, I bet I'd like a 50-50 there, maybe even less popular, but they're going to build a $12 million football complex with Drake University, and they're getting started on it, and that's going to be shared by a number of high schools for both football and soccer. So there's things that you might look at. Of course, that's a bigger community than this one, but not by much. So things like that you need to look at. And I've listed the athletic venues as part of that you might want to think about. And there's always the equity picture, Do all three high schools look alike? They may not look alike, but are they equal? That's the question. So, that answer your question. Did I talk too long?
No, you did great. And I think
Stepped in it again, or?
No, you did. You did fantastic.
So I can ask this question.
No, you did fantastic. He always does. He did a nice job of being setting the stage, and I'm sure there are some places where you'd like more detail, and others where you think we did put too much. But that's the conversation we want to have. It's always easier for us to start bigger picture and start zeroing down on things, and to say, here it is specifically to the building and to the number, and then try to walk that back from the community. And so we put this out here as a starting point. Again, our goal is to finalize this document by the end of the board meeting next week, and then kind of start going back into our community information sessions for that 6 to 7 week period before the note for the vote in November. So as Dwayne said, we just open up to questions at this point and kind of see where the conversation takes us.
So could someone indicate on their Group 2 life cycle project if the climate action and the high-back replacement upgrades are clearly related to each other?
Partially they are. Like we don't have very many. We have boilers that need to be replaced. They're natural gas, but then unrelated to HVAC would be the kitchens, where they have gas fires, they have steam heat, things like that, and they have natural gas appliances that need to be replaced, so they are related, but also a little different. And also in climate action can be our own fleet, our vehicles.
Right, I
That kind
understand,
of-
they're,
yeah.
they're things besides switching from natural gas.
I think that was the kind of the goal of the committee, Lisa could chime in on that, was to, reduce our dependence on natural gas, and even to a certain extent diesel, and get away from those fossil fuels, and that would be our first priority, and then move into other areas. Correct?
No, I think that's what we discussed, Wayne, because it was, we have to do it all, and there's some that we know we have to do, so let's do that first, and then see if there's been some advancements. Our ability to provide more green energy, more clean energy, without having to make those big time changes.
I'd love to start the long-term consideration conversation, but before that, I do have a question on the group one. It has at the high schools and elementaries and stuff, it has secure entrances and access improvements. And I know I thought we were done, but apparently we're never done with that kind of thing. So can somebody tell me what's left?
At the elementary school, there's one school that really needs a secured entrance, and that's Weber.
Okay.
Weber, that wasn't part of the project there, we added on, but we didn't do that. But we did Wickham, and Wickham is a sister school, and we know how it should be done now, so we need to go back and do Weber. And there's another elementary school, that'd be Coralville Central. Coralville Central, we've said from day one almost, there's an entrance that is secured, but it could be better, so that needs to be improved. And then at the high schools, one of the long-term, not long-term, but critical needs project was adding onto the front of that building, creating a student commons area and a more secured entrance, because frankly, West High they have secured doors and they have intercoms, but they don't have that visual presence of the front door. And its city is somewhat lacking this too. I mean, they have it, they're both secured, don't get me wrong, but they could be improved. So that's what one of that is.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sean, I appreciate you asking that question. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's that like almost type of input that we're asking for, because we've identified those as critical needs, not as long-term considerations. And so those are things that we think that, need to happen in the next few years. And so that's the question to the board, knowing that those are on there and that we're going to advance those. Do we want to go ahead and say, secure or upgrading entrances at Wickham and Coralville Central and Weber, these upgrades at West, right? Knowing they're in that first category, and we can show you a document that we have a draft of to give you an idea of what that might look like. But I think that's the piece that's part of the feedback we want is this enough as we go out to the public, or are we going to need to indicate some projects where they would be more specific to help make sure people would, okay, I see Rathina.
Yeah, I mean, just for me,
Yeah.
not being sort of the taxpayer putting on that hat, I would want to know where the multi-purpose room, gym, cafeteria upgrades are going, where the secured entrances are going. I think you get more investment instead of just listing just a laundry list of things, and people are like, well, how do I know it'll get done if I don't know where it's being done?
Sure.
I mean, just being transparent with the community. I also had a question, site and roadway improvements?
Let's take North Central, for example. Okay, they need some site improvements for their parking. All right, I mean, it's kind of congested there. We've made it better, but it could be even improved. But also, the city of Coralville wants to extend it's another road that goes through there. It's going to go right in front of the school and off the side of our property. And so we know there's going to be some improvements there.
So even though the city wants to do it, we
Yeah,
have to pay for it?
even though the city makes improvements, sometimes we end up paying for the improvements. Like, for example, when we did Alexander, we ended up paying for half of that street that runs on the north side of the building. We actually paid for the whole thing. We're going to share it with whoever built on the other side. Eventually, that's part of the agreement. But there are those kind of development agreements that we made in Alexander, same thing at New Hoover, the other side of that little side street.
Yeah.
So we'll probably continue to have those kind of site improvements that we'll be making to take a rough site and develop it. There'll be some improvements to that.
So when you say site and roadway improvements, does that include like a safer crossing path for students? Because I know that was a concern, like out at New Hoover,
Yeah.
crossing.
We would hope the city's paying for that part of it.
Okay.
I think there will be assessments for like the turnoff lane that they're putting in. You know, they're also gonna put a tunnel in under the road. They're paying for it, but I'm sure we'll get assessed for it somewhere down the road. You know, so that's using fun, but there are those kinds of things that we've done and will continue to do. I think.
So site improvements would also include outdoor classrooms.
Outdoor classrooms is another one we've looked at. We've had several requests, and I think Jeff could probably address that, but I know there's been 2 or 3 schools that want them sooner than later. They want to create some outdoor environments and some classrooms. I know we talked about it out at Weber, maybe Longfellow, if there's a couple others. Are those the 2, Jeff?
Longfellow's, and that's starting now. And,
Yeah. I'm trying to keep up. I get tired, so it's hard. So anyway, I know they're out there. You're right, Charlie. That's what that is.
So that, again, we have two site-related projects, description site and roadway improvements, what Regina's talking about, and then second, school site improvements into each group. So I just wondered if for publicity or messaging, that those things could be put together in some way. So that to me, Regina, maybe follow up what you said, to me, having outdoor classrooms is more key in my mind than having a site improvement.
Yeah, I get
to say with the city, I mean, putting a road in or something like that.
Yeah.
Although we have to build a road.
I was gonna say, I think it's really important that people understand we have to do this. And so if we don't pass this plan, those funds are going to come from the general fund. Because like, these are not things that we can ignore.
Yeah, I understand. I agree.
Well, Hoover and Alexander are 2 examples of that. Even Grant, we helped pay for that roundabout up there. And the street in front of Grant, you know, that tied the 2 streets together, we paid for part of that. So there's a lot of that you have to do to get these schools where you want them.
I agree that if we know more details about projects, it's good to provide that information, but it's a fine line, because I like having a one-pager, right? And like for marketing and like being able to hand somebody something and say like, here's some quick info. If we get too detailed on the one-pager, then we're handing in like a pamphlet, and it might be over. So maybe there's a balance of saying for more information on specific projects, go to the website.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we'll show it. We've got it.
So you don't want my 14-foot turnout?
I mean, I do.
Went the door.
But I know, like, I've got a lot of questions about the old Hoover, and like, are you still going to do something for the old Hoover site at City, or are you tabling that? And so if we know that we're going to move forward, it would be nice to reassure everybody, yes, that we said that in FNQ 1.0, we didn't leave it behind, still group 1 or group 2, whatever it is.
Well, we didn't leave it.
That's right.
So Lisa, your point's well taken. I mean, I'm on the same wavelength as you. As something that's a 1-pager, something we can put in different sizes, that is not so overly cumbersome. And so what you're going to see in this is that actually it is still a 1-pager. And so Matt and I were sidebarring. It's not just the balance about committing this too deep into detail, but it's also once we start sharing detail, and so back to Regina's point, we get in that spot where we basically have to show something for everybody, and so we don't want anybody to feel left out. And whether we've had a lot of discussion, is that by feeder pattern or is that by every single school? Because when you see it, you'll see that there is a good spread of projects across the different regions of our school district, but not every single school, I think, was listed in those critical needs.
Right, I think that's the way you would have to do it, is you'd have to be able to talk about in that first phase that we could do something for every region, something significant in every region, or attendance, feeder pattern like Chase is talking about, but I don't think we can guarantee that every campus is gonna see something in that first critical need phase, right? So that would be the balance we would have to create, like, if we wanted to be able to point to it, then do you gather support in each of those three kind of feeder areas to say, okay, well, there's something for everybody in this, but if we try to go to all attendance centers, it might be a challenge and then is it enough, right? And then if you do every attendance center, then is it enough compared to what the other building is getting? So I think those are just some of the things we're thinking through and would want to hear your feedback on. Sorry, now you can.
No, you're right.
Do sheet.
So, perfect timing.
Sorry, it took me 10 years to get in here.
So same thing that we just shared. The front page is the. You want me to drive? You want me to drive?
Would you?
So same thing that we just shared, but you look at the second page, especially that first category, and so you see it there that. So I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. Some of the projects that Dwayne talked about, right? And so you see it. First one, Coralville Central, that front entrance and an elevator. Then Garner, a cafeteria and front entrance stores. The classroom additions. Charlie talking about outdoor classroom spaces. We add that in there, and you can make that adjustment pretty easily, all the way down. And to Lisa, what you were saying, City High, talking about some of those pieces, the part you asked about. We have detailed out there at the end about the annex, and so we have thought through it. But again, obviously, draft watermark across it on purpose because we don't want anybody taking this back as this is what we're doing until we're ready to do that out. But we thought we might go here with the conversation tonight, so we at least wanted to put something down on paper to give the board an idea of is this the level of detail that we're talking about. And I think our suggestion would be if we do this detail, we limit it to the critical needs. Life cycle projects, by definition, are life cycle, and so we can't basically tell you what they're going to be year after year. We have some ideas of what would fall in that bucket, but you can't predict that for every year for the next 10 years. And then that third bucket, right, and those are, we believe, where that ties in best to the community engagement work we did, so we can start signaling more where we're going to take the feedback and what we're going to do in terms of long-term systematic improvements to our buildings that are based on teaching and learning, rather than some of the facilities pieces we focused on in FMP 1.0.
You have Hills still at the top there.
We do. It's the third one down. Hills Elementary, new building, demolition.
Yeah, you nailed exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I was going to use the dreaded word hybrid, but, I think on the critical needs, somebody can't decide, opinion-wise, saying, nah, that's not really a critical, if we think they're critical needs, and they need to get done, we can specify what those are. Everything else is a little more fluid, and we don't have to be as specific with it, so I think that's exactly what I approach this.
Yeah, well, that first part of that, Sean, that first bucket too is scope that didn't get done, that we couldn't afford to do, that we need to finish. So I don't know how you're going to wordsmith all that.
Well, yeah, it's finishing the promises that we made. We had a plan and we knew that we weren't getting everything done. And I think as individuals and as a board, we've talked about here's other things we're going to get on the list the next time around.
Yeah. So I like what you just said. So maybe it's something like completing the promise or something that ties that bridge. And so we can try to come up with something catchy. And that's it.
No new money.
No new money. That's it.
Something like that.
Yeah. And we've got to, we want to keep hitting that as well.
Tate High School's on there. We thought we did a pretty good job there, and we did. We added classrooms and an exercise room and a gym and improved the entrance and all that. But yet, when we're done, we're going, they needed a vocational one, and we didn't get it done, so it's up there. Those are the kind of things, as we went through those projects, my list kept growing and growing. And so those are the kind of things that you can do. You can kind of share the love. Even in that group, there's quite a few schools that are touched.
Yeah, I think this strikes a balance. So how certain are we that we need a new elementary school in North Liberty? Well, that's probably a big conversation.
It's another one of your long-term conversations. It can be, but I would tell you this, that I've seen the development plans that the Scanlons have, and it's right next to our site on North Liberty. Matter of fact, I think he might have approved an easement for it one meeting or two back, I thought I saw. And they're getting ready to turn dirt up there on the very east side of North Liberty, and right on North Liberty Road, which goes up and ties into where Penn is eventually, and it's north of the high school, about half a mile or so. That's going to grow. And then the other area is Coralville. They're planning that whole area that was called the Scanlon Farms, remember, which is south of Liberty High School. Between those two, they both get started here within the next year. You're going to have a huge demand for another school in that area. Now, is it the one up north of the high school, or is it the one right across the street from the high school? I don't know, but we own property in both places. So I'm still using the word we.
Well, but that's, where you ended was the critical piece. That's where we currently own pieces, parcels of ground that we could put a school on that are big enough for school sites. We don't own parcels in the south, they're in the west or the east, but we do own those two in the Coralville and North Liberty region. And so I think that's a big piece of it too.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Dwayne, but I've seen the plat for across from Liberty, that big space, they have 1,003 units that they're gonna put in there. And it's multifamily, single family, but that's 1,003 units. So four people in a home, that's 4,000 people that are gonna move across from the high school. So
Yeah,
You
I think
if
we're
they come,
yeah.
we're gonna need a new elementary school.
You can
But
usually
I don't know
figure,
if they're gonna come.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You can usually figure a half a student per unit.
Okay.
Easy. That's
So
fine.
that'd be 500 students.
That's an elementary school.
That's a big elementary school.
I don't know if it's an ignorant question. So the schools that are not listed there, right? Do they have these things that are listed on their scripture for these schools?
For the schools that aren't listed, do they have other critical needs that we don't have up there? Is that what you're asking, Romy?
No, I didn't know.
Not necessarily. Do they have these items that we've identified as critical for these schools? Do the other schools which are not listed, do they have these same things?
Oh, do they already have those things?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we'd feel, that in those situations, that's like Chase's part about completing the promise or, the bridge to completing the rest of the work. That gets them kind of to our standard of what we would try to look through. So those secure entrance, components, that's our standard for all those schools that that Weber, we would need to get them to that standard. Coralville Central, we want to get them to that safety and security standard because the rest of our buildings are there. So I'd want to probably double check the list to see if there's anything in there that we don't have in one of those other schools that wouldn't be comparable, but I think that's the standard we're working from is, okay, this would get them to, that basic need that we have in all those other buildings. But I think that's a good question. That's a good lens for us to make sure we put on there is that, okay, is there anything we're doing there that we wouldn't have on one of those other campuses? Dwayne, I don't know.
Well,
if you have
initially,
a
I'd
different take.
I'd say that this makes all the schools comparable. Okay, it makes them never be equal, but comparable. For example, Wickham's on that list for new gym. Well, the gym they have is kind of undersized, and we didn't put a gym there. Well, we put a gym almost every other elementary school while we're at it, So this is trying to make it balance out across the district, north and south, east and west.
What about career and technical offerings at all of the high schools? Can we tout that? We don't have, career and technical project descriptions for Liberty and West on this list. Certainly don't want to give the impression that we're in the career and technical to city and state.
I love your questions, Shirley, I always have.
But you know the answers to it.
So, at city, we basically wiped out their career tech programs with the fine arts edition, and they were in temporary locations, and they have a real need for it. Liberty has a career tech center, they have maker spaces, they have things like that. West High has it, it could be improved. So I think that's one of those long-term decisions that you need to make. What is it you're gonna offer at those schools?
Throughout the district or concentrate.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it too, Charlie, is like it's a critical need on, almost to Drone's question, right? It's a critical need on City High's campus, it's a district need when we look at overall CTE programming, how we compare it to other districts, or where we maybe want to take our CTE programming. So City High is starting from a different place than what we would maybe consider, and West High in comparison potentially to Liberty, are starting in different places than what we have one campus at. And then the conversation about where we'd like the district standard to be, you know, we still have leaps and bounds to probably get to that point too, where we want to be. So I think that's why I can envision it showing up in two places, right? Is, you know, we just need to get City High some space, first of all, and get some of those things going. But then as far as where we want to take CTE program, what the vision for it is, that's the long-term consideration. Are we sounding like we're on the right path for what is kind of amenable?
Yeah, this is enough detail, I think, and it's wide enough, I think. You touch lots of parts of the district that people will say, okay, I see how this, and nothing I don't think is too egregious or over the top. It's, well, what are they getting at? You know, Hills, for example, you really touch with the bond, you know. But I think the level of detail is good without getting, you know, as long as you guys feel comfortable that we can deliver that, all of those things. I wouldn't want to put it out there and be like, actually that new kitchen, no go.
There's some challenges at Hills.
With the new building.
Huh?
With the new building.
Well, where are you gonna put it? And do you put it behind the old and turn the old, or how do you do that? So there's some challenges.
But not to the point where it's questionable about if we can deliver on it. I think you're right, JP. I mean, if we say these things are critical needs and we come out with that, we have to do those things, right? I mean, that has to get done. That's continuing our promise there. Like Dwayne said, I mean, it's not that there's not work to do on these things, and that's why he's encouraged us to get going on these things, because we need to draft plans, we need to select sites for some of those things. We've engaged Hills in some of those conversations, but we don't have a definite plan about where that's going to go. Tim would love to have one, right, that we could talk through and that we could point to, but none of those things are insurmountable that we can't accomplish them, and I think we need to accomplish them if we put them on that critical needs list.
Yeah.
Two questions that, one, and I think you guys have the answer because I think I saw it at some point, was kind of what percent of that new, well, not new money, well, it is new money, but not new bond, but what percent of that is in this phase one or group one or whatever? You know, how much of that chunk is it? And then my second question is, how much of the conversation do we need to have looking at those long-term considerations ahead of anything really tonight, or ahead of a vote, or where do we need to coalesce there? So those are my two.
So on the first question, there's about 50% of the dollars are in groups 1 and group 2. So it leaves
1 and 2.
about 50% in group 3. So it's about just under 30% in that group 1. And so 30, 20, 50 is a rough estimate. So that's how it looks. In terms of the long-term considerations, as long as you all are comfortable with that variety of terms being out there as we go back to the public and we can talk about the conversations that are ongoing, we don't need to narrow that down tonight or even next week any more than the board feels comfortable. It goes back to what Dwayne said, is that at some time in the next 6 to 12 months, we are going to need to make some critical decisions because we really do want the facilities to match what our planning is instructionally, and that will influence that. Dwayne's example for early childhood is a great one.
Wow.
The difference between adding on classrooms to existing buildings or building early childhood centers, those are two totally different approaches. And so we don't need that direction right now, but we will in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, it's not an original thought on my part, because I've heard it said many times, but you know, we've been so lucky that we've been able to get our buildings up to standards, okay? And now you have the opportunity to take it to the next level. That's where you're at, you know? Finish, we have the promise we finished. Now you have a chance to move it up. The other comment I would make is that we need to continue to work with developers on our sites. And I don't know that you want to wait, that, you know, we maybe in the next few months bring you a couple potential sites that we've talked to developers about and get that going so you know what you're working with. Because if you wait too long on these developments, those properties go away and you lose the opportunities. We now have the opportunity to be proactive, so I would encourage you, that's number one in long term, I think, is to kind of tie down some of these properties and then figure out how you're gonna use them, and will they fit our needs.
So how are we doing that as
Can
a
I
board?
respond to that one yet, Charlie? And then take your question? The other thing I would say about those long-term considerations would be to hold tight on this terminology to the vote, right? And so if these are the things we've heard from community feedback, that these are the long-term considerations we want to know, we hold tight on what those are until the vote in November. And then as soon as we have that vote in November, we really kick up the conversation around these other components, right? And so that we don't conflate the two. We can't be in the middle of a conversation around this approach while we're asking people to go vote and support it. It's not something I would suggest. And so I think for us, we've already kind of talked about goal areas. We know what, and we're going to do that again in September. I don't see that necessarily changing or diverting from this, but there's some conversations here that I think once we know the vote outcome in November, then we engage in those conversations and really try to scale up, okay, what are these long-term considerations? What are the plans, moving ahead on that? But if you guys have different thoughts on that, I'd be willing to hear them, but I don't think you necessarily want to jump into a magnet school conversation next week, right, as we
I
approach this
think
vote. Yeah.
the long terms definitely would make it much more decisive when you're trying to get folks to vote. That's why I'm trying to.
Right,
put
and
my
so I think that's a good
voter
question
hat
because
on, what's
yeah.
going to make me more likely to vote? Because I think what you're saying is people would vote against something potentially, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we want to do that. I think what we
want
want them to know is these are things we're going to continue to engage the community around. These are some considerations of what we've heard in a first round of community engagement. We have plans to continue to talk about these components, right? I mean, I think, maybe early childhood ed is one where we've handled a little bit different. We've been pretty clear about what our goal is there, and we've had a conversation even at this table to say, hey, we're committed to looking at our opportunities there. But some of these other ones, yeah, you don't necessarily want to put something out there and say, well, I'm against that, so I don't want to support the whole thing. We want to be able to take those projects differently after the vote in November.
And so, Charlie, to your question about how does that conversation look, I mean, we talked a lot about why these run here, not on the basis of the feedback, but we went through and said, okay, can we tie every single one of these concepts to the pieces on this part of the paper? And so that conversation continues to be a fun one. And if people are like, well, we don't like X, we're like, well, I mean, we're here because we did this part and it fits under one of these buckets, and then we continue to narrow it down. So I think we continue to anchor back to the work that we did this spring, whether it's portrait of a graduate or the work that the board did around guiding principles, or the work we did with the community this summer. And that, as Matt said, after we get past November, we start having more detailed conversations and just kind of take them further.
So it's a lot easier to do this after we have the funding to do it.
Absolutely.
One of the key pieces too about going to the voters with this now is it allows us to have those long-term consideration discussions. We don't need this tomorrow to have these votes because the PEPL expires in 2025. But by going to the voters now, it allows us the opportunity to look ahead and the board to make those thoughtful considerations of all of these things that we have on this list going forward. For example, the PEPL right now gives us $12.5 million a year. If we don't have the voter portion of that, that drops to about $2 million. And Jeff's over there just cringing because he's only got $2 million to do the life cycle, and right now we spend almost $7 million of that $12.5 million for life cycle. And so that difference is used for our bus leases that relieves stress on the general fund, our swimming pool leases that also provides, that's almost $1.5 million. That difference then is where we can use for these long-term considerations. And so that's why it's important to get this out there to the voters to look at it now. It doesn't mean we're going to go start borrowing against it on November 4th at all. It allows us the opportunity to move forward with these discussions. So I think that's a critical piece as you look forward as well, and as you communicate with people, is it allows us to do this planning going forward for 10, and then in terms of the save dollars till 2050. So 21 years beyond the current RPS. So
yeah,
we
you
are
really
looking
couldn't
long
even
term.
have these conversations without the funding, right? I mean,
Right.
There's no point in having
Right.
the conversation if the funding's not there.
So when we're talking to the public, I'm assuming we're gonna use language like that, because should they understand the risk of not passing it, we eliminate this.
There's a
12
definite
thing.
cost to it, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, yeah.
So, and I mean, spell it out, just like last.
Like this, if this doesn't pass, class sizes will be bigger, done.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
Or there's
I mean,
no
that's-
swimming team because we
Right,
can't
there's no
afford the
swimming,
pool.
I mean, like seriously, we
You
need
gotta cut
to
something.
show
Yeah.
real implications of this not passing. Because, you know, with the projects, people, we know some people, will look at that, well, what about me and my school? But these things affect everybody, regardless of what school you're at.
And we can work on a couple of different promotional pieces that we can use. We also want to make sure that we don't violate state law. Nothing anybody said has, right? We can't all we can do is advocate people to go vote. We can't technically say you have to vote yes. Now, we can do what Regina just said,
Yeah.
if we don't have this funding source anymore, these things go away.
Yeah.
And so we can put together some of those different informational flyers and pieces. Kristen does a really nice job of making things look like this, and so we kind of let her drive the train on that because you can't get it all on one page, and there are different strategies that will impact different voters. Some will be, what is my school getting? Others will be swimmers, and they're like, wait, swimming's going away if this doesn't pass? And so I think it is a good idea to have that balance and to be able to speak to people using vernacular or projects or lack of things that resonate with them most. Okay.
I have a thought and I've lost
Yeah.
it,
Oh.
but I think one of the questions that we'll probably get is why now, right? Because it's not like we could go borrow money on, or we are not going to go borrow money on November 4th, right? So people will be like, why can't you just wait a while and see what shakes out, right? So that'll be something that we have to address, right? I don't think most people grasp the concept of how much time it takes to plan all of this, right? That's not what people do on a daily basis, right? So why can't we just decide, in 2025 that we want to borrow some money now and make that decision then, and then we're good to go, right? So that's something we'll have to kind of work out. And somebody had said the question earlier about specific school versus like feeder pad, that area. And I think we have to learn a little bit of lesson from Hoover, because that's exactly the conversation that happened there. Was very specific, my school, but we're helping city, which is where your kids will go eventually, right? Like that conversation didn't work real well for some of the community. It worked for some. There was a disconnect there. Some people totally bought into it, some people didn't. So that's something to think about as we kind of look through all of the areas that we're working on. That's a pretty good spread of schools, when I look at it. But all it takes is, a handful of people at a school that's not there. Yeah, you get a thing person to be upset about it. Right?
Yeah, the other part of that big picture is that, up north, we have newer facilities, and the issue there is growth, and capacity. Where the issue on, the older parts of town is the older buildings need a little more repair and a little more love, so.
Yep.
And if you were to put this off till 2025, somebody at the east side said that, well, look what we're gonna do to the city, we can't do this if we don't pass it now. And the city will never be what it should be without it.
Well, I think a good evidentiary piece there too is the situation we found ourselves in approaching FMP 1.0, right? If we don't keep things moving, if we don't bridge this gap, if you don't keep ahead of these things, then what happens is, the situation we found ourselves in about needing FMP 1.0 and how behind, we were in several of those areas. And so, part of this is making sure we stay the course and we keep pace and that we keep updating things where we need them before, everything goes into the critical needs list, right? And then we don't have the revenue to do the things we need to do.
One question off of that, when would we absolutely, say it fails, which I feel pretty confident, it's 50% plus one vote. But how often can we go back to the community? And then when is our sort of must-have by this date for both RTS and the PEBL?
The earliest that it could go back to the voters would be next September, because there's specified dates in the Iowa code now of when you can have the elections. And so next year in 2022 is only in March and September. And you need 6 months on some of these ballots. I'd have to go back to which ones specifically is 6 months before you can go back. So that eliminates March right there, okay? But to have the funds available, at least on the PEPL side of things, in 25-26 fiscal year, because our current levy expires in 25, we would need to have it approved for the board to certify the levy in March of 2025. So yes, that's 4 years away, but really you're 3 years away when you take out a year, almost a year, when you lose because of not being able to go back to the voters. And so you need to have it by, I'd have to look at which fiscal year when you could do the votes, because you'd have to do the votes sometime early in 24 to do that. So, we're actually down to within 2 years.
Sure. And
Not to
that's-
get too technical, but that takes away that whole long-term consideration that Matt was just alluding to, and ability to plan by not having that there. And, by able to access in some of these funds, it does that design work that Sean was just mentioning, and people don't understand that you don't just go plan a building and start, putting bricks out there tomorrow. It takes, 6-9 months or whatever, depending upon the project.
It's not like putting a flower garden in my front yard.
Yeah.
And then on RPS, what's the timeline on that?
In terms of, the votes would be the similar time.
Okay,
I mean,
similar.
2 or 3, depending upon which year, odd or even year. So it's 2 next year and an even numbered year. And the same thing, the current RPS is good through 2029, but to access any funds for any of these construction projects through 2050, we have to have an approved RPS. So really we're asking people to approve the RPS. We're not asking for any borrowing. We're asking for an approved RPS that allows us to access this funding to make these projects viable and possible.
Okay. So, worst case scenario we can go back, but truly it's good to get in early so we can
Mhm.
start the work.
Mhm.
Because this is where we're at in our planning process.
Right.
I want to go back to the areas in the district that are growing. As I understand it, looking at enrollment numbers, every area in this school district is increasing enrollment. So we're not doing this because North Liberty or Coralville are increasing enrollment. And they need to be, those kids need to go to school. We're doing it because every part of the district is increasing enrollment, and every kid in the district needs to go to school. So I would like us to avoid taking our enrollment and growth messaging from the Press Citizen and actually using the data that's in front of us, which has always been in front of us, frankly, in terms of overall enrollment growth in the district.
But I think that's a good point, Charlie, that we do have growth in all of those parts. I think, that kind of goes back to, I don't know if it was when JP was asking a question, but we have the land purchased in those 2 areas, right, to do new schools, and then with the classroom additions to support growth.
And perhaps some of the.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we need to keep looking for those opportunities and get moving on those, so, yep. So we kind of on track for the 14th and coming back then next week, and we'll probably share this and this detailed version, right? I mean,
We'll probably center in on one version to share, and it will look more like that one if that's where the board's comfortable is.
I think that's the way to go, personally.
This one.
Yeah, it's transparent, and at the same time,
you got 2.
yeah, it covers a huge wide swath of the district, I'm not worried. And for people who say, well, what about my school?
Scroll down.
This one's
Well, go look at your school, like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of these schools.
I think part
Well, I
of,
was gonna say, what about my school? Well, what did your school get in MVP?
Yeah, like Kirkwood's
Well,
not on
no.
there, but nobody at Kirkwood is gonna be complaining because it's so they love it, right? It's wonderful.
Well,
they
then
lived
you
through
just
2
challenge.
Maybe not
years.
nobody.
You just challenged, you threw him a challenge.
Well, I think part of it is, we just talked about those dates, right? your school now is not gonna be your school by the time
Right.
we get that stuff.
And that too. But I think
It's just not.
feedback I've heard, people are super happy with the bond projects, right? People are really happy with their schools. There's not as much, complaining.
Well, and I hope we can capitalize on some of that, right? That they, there should have been some confidence instilled from how we carried out the first plan, that the results were good, that your school building did see good things, and so, you start to endear some support that way as well, hopefully, as you approach the second piece. So yeah, Chase has the groups 2 and 3 on there, so then group 1 will flesh out more like the detailed version, and then that's what we'll bring on the 14th just for the public conversation and go from there.
And it's not so tight that if people bring things up, they're not like one can fit under another category or two.
Correct.
Sure, take a look at it.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thanks, Glenn.
My pleasure.
Very good.
Good seeing you.
Let's go ahead and move on to our next topic, because I'm sure everybody's waiting to talk
Sure.
about health and safety.
Yeah, and this may be brief, it may not be brief, but we had a couple things kind of come to our attention here late last week, over the weekend, and then even as we approach tonight, that we felt it was important to have some conversation with you guys about. One, we received some new guidance from the Iowa Department of Public Health in conjunction with the Iowa Department of Ed. I forwarded that to you. It shows the Iowa Department of Public Health comments and then a Q&A from the Department of Ed, and specifically talks about the authority to quarantine students, and talks about that school districts do not have the authority to do that without involvement from a public health agency, which we've had involvement from public health, from our local public health, and so we feel good about that, but that in conjunction with another piece of information we don't feel as good about for our secondary schools. Johnson County Public Health had contacted us late last week and said that they recommended us pausing the quarantine portion with the secondary schools because they were having a hard time being able to keep up with that process, that students were being notified several days after a potential exposure, and so really the time, energy, and effort that's going into that process, we're not realizing any benefit on mitigation of the virus at that point if we're notifying people several days after the fact. They said if that were to be transferred to our staff, that they also believe we'd experience the same delay. I think with that, even if we were transferred to our staff, I think there's a couple things that come into question as far as then are we consulting with public health based on that guidance piece we got, or now have we assumed all of that responsibility internally? Even if we got around with that, I think that we still have the potential problem of not sure it's being effective. We have more kids in the buildings this year, which is a different challenge than last year. We knew we had a higher percentage of students online last year. We had our other groups split into hybrid for a good portion of the year, 50-50. And even when we went to 100%, we still didn't have the sheer volume there as well. Our secondary students have the ability to be vaccinated, as well as our staff. So I think we kind of wanted to bring that to you for conversation tonight, knowing that they've given us that information before we just implemented any kind of change. I didn't feel good about just implementing a change at the secondary level since we'd had a lot of conversation around quarantines. Elementary, we're not suggesting a change in practice there from the quarantining approach, but one thing we would like to put in place was kind of the exchange we had throughout the weekend as far as when there's an exposure, or when there's, a confirmed case in a classroom, that we would immediately notify that class that there's been a confirmed case in that classroom. As contact tracing efforts are completed, we want parents to have that information so they can make a decision about sending their child or not. We would put that step in the elementary process, and then the suggestion would be, knowing the issues I just outlined for you at the secondary level, that is the approach we'd use at the secondary level, that we would let the kids know, or the students know in that student's classroom that there's been a confirmed case in a classroom or in a class that they were part of, and then parents could make the decision at that point if they wanted to quarantine their student or keep them home, or if they wanted to continue to send them to school. So I know that was a lot. Happy to go back through any of those components, but the thing I'd want to just end on is reiterating that step I said we put in place, and that's the immediate notification, contact tracing or not, that if Alice Degner in 4th grade today had a kid in her class that was COVID positive, we would have gotten a phone call home to say there was COVID positive student in Alice's class today. Contact tracing won't be completed for a period of time, but we could keep her home at that point if we wanted to until that was completed. So with that, Lisa, I see you're
Yeah.
ready to go.
Who's gonna make that call? The teacher or school nurse? Like, who are we gonna ask to do that work?
Yeah, we'd be working with, of course, a lot of that lift for determining who that student was is communication with the nurse and public health still, right, about the positive case. But we've talked about trying to have principals help with that communication and make sure that communication goes out. That was the example we had at Wood on Friday where Maria was able to take the lead on that communication and put out that call. Secondary, I'm not as clear yet. We probably have to talk through those details just because the principals would then have to probably go through and, if it was a 5th period class, that's a little different challenge to solve for that secondary principal than it is for the elementary principal. So that I think we'd still want to talk some details on.
So the call goes out right away, and then at the elementary level, we're still going to do contact tracing. Is Johnson County Public Health going to do that?
So
Like they
I
have?
think an important distinction to make that I'm not sure we've been super clear on before, our staff still contact tracing. We turn over that information to Johnson County Public Health, who then makes the notification to families. And Kate or Jess, if I say anything that's inaccurate or needs to expound it upon, let me know. But we're gathering a lot of that data for them and collecting that research information, and then Johnson County makes the notification. So that process would still stay the same at the elementary level.
And so then, if a parent gets the call on Monday, that the whole class, and then they receive notification on Thursday, hey, you have to quarantine, and they pulled their kid out on Monday, will we be able to count those 3 days towards their quarantine requirement?
Yeah, I don't see any reason that wouldn't count, Lisa.
Okay.
Yep.
Because this is kind of year round, so it goes
Yeah,
back to
yeah,
it goes back to the
that's
date
No.
of exposure, no matter.
Yeah, it
when.
does. So our nurses are doing the contact tracing. They get notification of the positive case, and then they do the contact tracing during the school day. We're not doing, unless it's athletics, like school, we're not doing like what they're doing on the weekends and who they hang out with on the weekends. That's Johnson County Public Health. So we are actually providing letters to the families stating that we've identified them as close contacts. We anticipate Johnson County Public Health is going to ask you to quarantine until this date. So we're giving them a date because initially we weren't, and our nurses were just getting bombarded with phone calls. We couldn't keep up with everything. So I talked to Public Health, and we now have a date in the letter, so that it gives parents something. It gives them some information. But yes, if the quarantine period starts from the date of their last exposure. So sometimes we're notified. There's times that students are in school and have a runny nose and parents think it's allergies, and then they end up getting worse and they get them tested and they're positive. But the symptoms maybe started 5 days ago and they've been in school. So it's based off of that last date of exposure is when so if they weren't in school since, like, say, Wednesday, but we know they were contagious Monday and Tuesday as well, then we base on all of those days that they were in school. So we do contact tracing for, like, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, because there might be kids absent or, so there's the potential that kids will have different quarantine periods based on their last date of exposure.
And
Does that
then,
make sense?
so it really sounds like the only change at the elementary level is that parents will be notified sooner that they may be a close contact and that they can make the decision to stay at home early or take a wait-and-see approach. But that's the only change at the elementary level.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that step's necessary because I don't think we anticipated the delay with some of this, and so that's probably just a good proactive step we need to put in place at this point.
It just sounds like another layer of mitigation,
Yeah.
which I think it's, the more mitigation, usually the better. But at the secondary level is what I'm hearing, we're going to kind of step back from contact tracing.
Yeah, and that's what I was outlining at the beginning. I think that would be what we would propose to you tonight based on, Johnson County suggested it to us, right? They said, we think we should push pause on this. You're trying to exclude kids, 5 days after the fact. It's not really, again, I kind of keep going back to this, you're not realizing the benefit of what you put contact tracing and quarantining in place for, right? You're trying to keep them out of there from infecting other people. And if we're so delayed in notifying them, we're not really getting the benefit out of doing that process in time. I mean, like, essentially they would have potentially infected other students at that point or something to that effect. I think we would feel more comfortable following that pause, also for the fact that, the students do have access to the vaccine, our staff has had access to the vaccine, that we could also, we want to start those conversations again around those vaccine clinics and try to promote more of that, potentially at our buildings. Chase has been on the phone today trying to work on some of those components with our partners. So I know that doesn't feel real good to do less in that sense, but I do think it's a reality for us about the time and resources we have and where we commit those time and resources to make sure we're using those effectively. I also just tell you, I think if we tried to take this back on house, we'd lose some nurses. We're just not in a position to probably keep our staff.
But in reality, the quarantine policy at the secondary level has always been, if you're vaccinated and you wear a mask, you don't need to quarantine, correct?
Yeah,
That's
Right,
yeah.
right, and you agree to wear a mask for back. And so I feel like students have the ability to keep themselves just as safe as they had last week. If we do this change, they still have the ability to keep themselves safe, and they do that by getting vaccinated and wearing a mask. Unless I'm missing something, which is possible.
So,
Yeah, no, that's how I.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
students
so question,
keep themselves safe, but that's.
so
not
no
necessarily-
quarantining, and this is Johnson County Public Health is suggesting that's impossible given the time lags and stuff like that. When we do have a positive case, would there still be a communication to families to say
Yeah.
your child was,
That's the
exposed
step
at
that
some
would-
point, so that at least parents have that information?
Yeah, good question, Janet. That's the step that would mirror the elementary communication. We would communicate that just like we would that step we're adding in on the elementary process in the front end. So they would still know. So if a family did want to self-isolate, we would work with them to
Yeah.
excuse those absences. They could definitely do that.
Okay, that's good.
It would be more targeted than last year's general communication because
That was just by building.
it was just by building. So this year we would actually, as Matt was saying, we would identify all 7 class periods and send it to all the families in those 7 classes.
I mean, that's still a bit of a communication burden, but I think families would appreciate knowing.
Yeah, that notice will also feel different to our staff, right? I mean, right now you're telling them you have to stay home from school.
Yeah.
There's a whole line of communication that follows that, right?
Yeah.
Versus if, hey, just wanted you to know, your
Yeah.
student was in a class with another COVID-19 student, right? So those are two different, but you're right, there's some lift with that. It's not gonna be, free from work on trying to line up, okay, who's everybody this student would have had class with during the school day.
So the Johnson County Public Health, are they saying that they think this change will not increase transmission in the secondary school?
Well, we can't necessarily
Yeah, I don't know if
speak
you wanna-
for Johnson County Public Health, but they were just trying to prioritize the way they utilize their resources and the way that we utilize our resources as we look at what will have the greatest benefit for the school district and for the community, Charlie.
Yeah.
And as they tried to weigh those factors and look at where they could spend their time and energy, they just said because the availability of the vaccine at the secondary level, this one falls down the priority list. So I don't think, so they weren't going on record and saying it wouldn't have an impact. They were just trying to look at how we both organizations work together with limited resources.
Okay.
And I think they're considering, our most kind of vulnerable group would be those unvaccinated kids at the elementary level, potentially right now. And so can they get their resources to make sure, I don't want to promise they're going to improve the timeline, but does that help them accelerate notifying those families on those cases if they're not waiting through all these secondary ones at that time?
And what's the distribution of cases that we've seen so far this year between elementary and secondary?
Kristen, do you have
I was gonna say, where's Kristen?
I'm right here. I'll have to dig into that. Just 1 second. I'll look up there.
So let's just looking that up. Did Johnson County say that they were not going to do secondary contact tracing or help with that anymore? Did they say they were done? Or they're just asking us?
They said
I think they tried to say it as nice as possible.
they suggest we pause it
Yeah.
for right now, and that if we did see a spike or an increase, that they would come back around and that they would obviously want to reconsider that. But right now, they want to.
I don't
pause
think
that.
we could count on them to do it, Sean. I think the
I'm
option would
asking
be,
that
yeah.
along with the FAQ from a state that flat out says schools cannot engage in contact tracing without the involvement of a public health agency.
Right.
Can't do it. It's pretty clear. So if they're not doing it, we're not allowed to do it.
So we're stuck.
I think that's our
That's
question.
just, that's,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah.
I don't have enough
That's the
hands to
dilemma.
type on behind my back.
Yeah, I'm not willing to agree that we can't do it at all. I want to keep that door open in case we have to, because it says you have to work with Johnson County Public Health, and I think that you could interpret that broadly, like they tell you what the guidelines are, and you implement their.
That's
so
what
it's-
it says under the quarantine stuff, but not on
What's
the
it?
contact tracing part.
But even
Or
with
just
the
a-
So,
contact tracing.
but I don't think we need to get there to, I'm
Right.
just saying, leave it open for the future in
Yeah.
case we see
Yeah,
big
I-
numbers.
Right, and so for the
Yes.
future, I think we'll still have that conversation though,
Yes.
that if the professional, I mean, not that our nurses aren't professionals, but the public health experts are seeing these huge delays where, I mean, we have kids not being told for 5 to 7 days that you were close contact. What good is that?
I think Lisa's right, that we want to keep the door open in
We can
case
keep it open.
we want to exclude kids from school potentially, for a reason or something other. So we don't want to necessarily concede that, but I think you're right, Sean. I would have reservations with just jumping into that right now. I think we'd want to have a lot more conversation, but I do think we want to reserve the right to look at that further if we would need to at some point.
I got my letter from the school, the nurse, about my kid. We're now on day 11, have not been contacted by Johnson County. Right, so
How long did it take though for you to get that initial letter?
I got that letter really fast,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
And that was from
the
us,
school
right?
district.
Right, that was
Yeah,
from
us.
they're sending it like
And I
immediately.
think really, the reality is there's only so many people to do this work. There's only so many hours in the day.
Right.
And any of our school nurses could get a job anywhere not in the district. Like,
If only there was $95 million available to help schools do
With this
this
exact
type,
problem.
yes.
Got lost in the
right,
mail.
thank you. But I want to be mindful of that, we want to keep people hired, and we want to, Johnson County Public Health as well. Nurses are hard to come by.
So
So,
Chris,
to Charlie, to your answer about the distribution of cases, there have been 90 total cases so far this year among our students. 29 of them were at the secondary level,
So the
So-
majority is.
the majority of
in the elementary, yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
And I feel very comfortable working as closely as we can with Johnson County Public Health. I mean, we're educators and volunteer board members, and they're the Department of Public Health. And I think it's, not just the law, but yeah, do you want to fight the law and also the people whose expertise we're really looking on to get us through.
I think it's a good
Thanks.
point. Been a great partner to us.
So I mean, if we're amenable to this, we would, and Charlie, maybe you had something else you were gonna ask there first before I start going down this path, but we would move towards this change pretty quickly, meaning tomorrow. And then we would also, though, rehash a little bit of this conversation with you next week for a more public setting with the board during that time, and we'll come back with also, more information on vaccines, testing, and have a more complete health and safety update for you at that point. But operationally for us, it was crunch time, and that's why we felt the need to do something here this evening. So thank you for all, being agreeable to the conversation and getting to this point. So
Do we have a notion about what the prevalence or the consistency of mask wearing is between elementary and secondary school? Just thinking Kristen's number of 2/3 of infections are in elementary.
well, anecdotally, we talked to the West High principal today, and he said 90% of staff and 90% of students wearing masks. So we felt good about that. I'm not sure that would be accurate in all of our campuses, or I'd want to guarantee that, Charlie, but I do think mask wearing here, from talking to my peers, is much higher than what we're seeing in many other schools across the state. And so I do think we feel pretty good about that. I do think we have to continue to push mask use. We can't get lazy on it. We can't quit pushing around vaccines and making sure that if you're sick, get a test, right? I mean, to that point about, some of those symptoms just kind of muddling along and not getting tested, so.
I heard from one of our elementary buildings today, 80% students and 100% staff. So again, 1 out of 21 buildings.
What, I guess just a question, what's our signage like for proper mask wearing, hand washing. I mean, I assume we have signage up encouraging all that.
I mean, we do, and because of the language we used last year, it's a consistent message from last year, same signage, and so students are seeing the same reminders that they saw last year, so we had to change that. We have some of the added signage from our partners in the DPO, but then, you know, Kristen's resent out all the different files so they can print them and put them up. But we have, and when we go visit buildings, you see the different signs around campuses.
Great. Not in the building, so not allowed.
But I would say, you know, for us too, I mean, you know, we do try to look for it when we go out to buildings. If you do, you know, hear from anybody from their experience that they don't think there's appropriate signage, I mean, that's an easy thing for us to fix, and I think we'd want to know, because the more reminders we can give folks, that's an easy one for us to address.
No, I see is carrying signs up all over the place. So it's nice.
So another question came up, you know, in the spring when we did change, for lack of a better term, our quarantine policy, but which guidance we were following. The folks asked the questions, you know, what does that do retroactively to anybody who currently might be doing whatever? Do we have communications to go out to anybody in that regard, or?
We've talked some about it, Sean. I think we would like to be, you know, we would like to try to do some retroactive things if possible, but I think we also want to feel a little bit certain about the folks we've asked to quarantine and what their exposure was. So that'll be pieces we work on tomorrow. I shouldn't overpromise anything here tonight, but that is a definite question that we know we need to answer and that we'll need to look at before we just invite everybody back. We'd want to have a communication to them about, yes, you're okay to come back or not. Somebody that we would have just, you know, potentially put on one, you know, is that a different situation that somebody's been out for 7 days, you know, no symptoms at this point, and they're waiting for day 10 or something. So we'll work through those logistical pieces tomorrow. And we could, you know, ask that question again on the 14th, and we'll have a definite answer about how we handle those.
Yeah, I just think, you know, talking about coming back next week and talking about it in a more public setting, right? This is kind of, I mean, it's public, right? It's, people can listen to it at some point, but I don't know that most people are going to hear about it. But as soon as they hear that anything's changing, particularly any folks that it's very personal to, you know, their child is currently in limbo or whatever, right? They're going to want to know, what does that mean for me right now, right? So if stuff changes tomorrow, I don't know how quickly you're going to hear from folks.
Right, and I think we
after
will.
tonight, but you certainly will after next Tuesday for sure.
Yeah, I think we'll hear from some people tomorrow, because I'm sure, you know, they'll hear a little bit about what happened. And so I just don't want to say a blanket yes for everybody that it's retroactive. I think we want to make sure we've talked about every scenario, you know, and that we feel good.
That makes sense, right? Because some people have been traced to have been a close contact.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably are much higher risk than others, so I think it's important to hold to that. Sure. Any other questions or comments on this topic? Directors? Team? We good?
We're good. Thanks, guys.
I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So we'll second.
All fair?
Aye.